Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event, and welcome to any new people this week. We also have people watching on Facebook and people listening to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Community Radio, FM 88 in Melbourne, or j-air.com.au everywhere else. Welcome, everyone. My name's David Adler. I'm president of AJA, and unfortunately part of our team is away still. One is travelling, and Robert Gregory is attending a diplomatic event with the Ukrainian ambassador, and in view of circumstances there, we thought we had to split the organisation and be in two places at once. Already on our screen, you can see our special guest, Senator Claire Chandler. The format tonight is an interview-style discussion followed by questions and answers. If you'd like to ask a question, the best way to do that is to use the raise your hand icon in the reaction button, and we may or may not be able to get to written questions, more likely not, because we're a little short-handed today. Now, we have circulated Senator Claire Chandler's brief bio in the flyer, and you may have seen that. She's a senator from Tasmania. When she was first elected at age only 29, she was the youngest female senator, and she's also chaired an important parliamentary inquiry into human rights in Iran, and we'll no doubt mention that. But the real thing I wanted to say by way of introduction is sometimes when you meet politicians, they obviously have a public profile which creates an assessment. Some people surprise on the low side, some are exactly what you expect. Senator Chandler was very impressive when Robert and I met her in her parliamentary office a few weeks ago, and she's in that rare category of exceeding expectations. As you'll see, she's knowledgeable, and she also presents as a very good person. So welcome, Senator Chandler, and thank you so much for joining AJA this evening.
Thank you very much, David. Those are such kind words and introduction, and thank you for inviting me along this evening, and thank you for all of the work that you are doing at the AGA. I've obviously had a bit to do with your organisation now. My capacity is Shadow Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs and Chair of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Senate References Committee. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight speaking with 95 people who have decided to take an hour out of their Wednesday to hear from me. I'm truly humbled by that. So thank you everyone for being here.
Senator Chandler, I should let you know that in addition to the Zoom logins, which you see, there is a group on Facebook, and we upload onto YouTube, and it'll reach some hundreds and maybe even approach 1,000, by far the largest Jewish community platform in Australia. Given the subject tonight is women's rights from Tehran to Melbourne, I've got to ask you what in normal circumstances would be a pretty stupid question, but nowadays it has to be asked. What is a woman?
A woman is an adult human female, and you are entirely right that 5 or 10 years ago that question would have been an entirely uncontroversial one to respond to in that way. But these days we're living in a bit of an alternate universe where words have come to mean other things, and there have been those who, whether they're in the media or activists, who determine that words in fact should mean other things. So yes, I'm very glad to be here tonight talking about women's rights generally, but yes, whenever I'm asked the question, that is the response that I give, because that is what a woman is.
Yeah, well, having the disadvantage of a medical degree, I sometimes add the technical aspect that if you've got an XX sex chromosome, you're female. If you've got XY, you're male. And despite what you might do to your outward appearance, you can't change your DNA.
Yeah.
Okay, let's drill down on our subjects, and I'll start with Iran, because we have seen a lot of protests there. They were perhaps driven by young women, at least initially. You chaired an inquiry for the Australian Senate into human rights issues in Iran. Can you say briefly what were the major themes of that inquiry and what were the major conclusions?
Sure. So that inquiry was initiated towards the end of 2022, following the increased protest activity, the very brave protest activity that was taking place in Iran after the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody. And we were seeing a lot of particularly young Iranians, particularly female Iranians, women and girls, protesting over the death of a young woman who was only arrested for wearing her hijab incorrectly. And I felt at the time, and my colleagues in the coalition at the time felt that the response of the government to what was happening in Iran was completely inadequate, both in terms of the way that they were responding to the protests themselves, but also the way that they were engaging with I should say, rather not holding to account what is fundamentally an authoritarian regime. And so we initiated the Senate inquiry to be able to understand the issues facing the community within Iran, but also the Iranian diaspora community in Australia. And obviously there were some very, very brave people who put submissions into that inquiry, because one of the really concerning things we found out through that inquiry was the level of foreign interference and foreign surveillance that's happening by the Iranian regime of individuals within the Iranian diaspora here in Australia. So there were a number of findings out of that committee report, the first of which was that the Australian government should list the IRGC as a terrorist organisation, which is something that they haven't yet done. There were also a lot of recommendations around sanctioning the IRGC and individuals within the IRGC, which again, at the time, the government hadn't moved on. So I do think that Senate inquiry was able to inform some of the government's action in that regard. And we also looked a lot at, the transparency over the government's relationship with the regime, hostage diplomacy, a whole host of issues that have become, progressively more topical over the last few years as Iran has sought to, flex their muscles on the international stage. But it was an incredibly important piece of work, and a piece of work that I'm really proud of. We're currently in a situation where the government is still formulating their formal response to that report, and I'd certainly like to see that be forthcoming, particularly in a situation where we know that Iran was elected, I think it was just this week, to chair the UN Human Rights Social Forum. They are still getting a lot of airtime in a lot of multilateral and international bodies, and that's not what we should be doing when at the same time they are oppressing their people in the way that they are.
Claire, we have quite a dim view of Iran. We think it's a major security threat. We see it in the Middle East, obviously, with the issues that Israel faces and the amount of terrorism that is funded by Iran. Only today they announced a supersonic missile. Who knows how real that is. Compared to other Western countries, I've heard it said that the Albanese Labor government is a bit of a weak link, that other Western countries have gone further. They have listed the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. Is that a fair assessment? We are a bit of a weak link in the Western world?
Look, I think that probably is a fair assessment. We have not moved as far as many of our allies have in terms of our response to Iran, and you're entirely right. The United States has listed the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. They're a key ally of ours. I just don't understand how we can be in a situation where they say they're a terrorist organisation, but we don't. Other countries were sanctioning Iran before we started utilising sanctions. So there has been a bit of a lag there, and from my conversations with the Iranian diaspora in Australia, and many of whom are in Melbourne and in other populated cities on the mainland, they really seemed, I think, a bit let down by the lack of response in comparison to what other countries are doing in that regard. They're a very well-connected diaspora across the globe, I think, and seeing, certain things happen in the US or certain things happen in Canada or in Europe, and then seeing the response here was a bit disappointing for them.
To be fair, I'm going to point out something. I hope you're not too uncomfortable about this, that Liberal governments in the past have also been dragging the chain. Here is a photo of Michael Danby, who paid for a poster, a large billboard, say no to Bishop's Iran deal when Julie Bishop was foreign minister and she visited the Iranian regime, etc. I suspect that attitudes in the coalition have shifted, with people like yourself and James Patterson and Andrew Hastie, and if you like, the next generation of parliamentarians who are interested in security. Is that a fair assessment, that there is a contrast between the Julie Bishop era and what's there now?
I wasn't in the parliament then, so I probably can't really compare and contrast that effectively, but what I can say is that certainly there are a large group of colleagues in the parliament who are concerned about Iran from a security perspective, but also who have significant Iranian diaspora in their own electorates, and that's been a really important conversation for those MPs to be having with their Iranian diaspora and understanding what the concerns are. Keith Wallahan and Aaron Violi in Victoria, Paul Fletcher, Julian Lisa in New South Wales, and that, just to name a few, have been very deeply engaged with their local Iranian communities, and likewise their Iranian communities have been very effective at advocating to their local MPs what their concerns are. So yeah, I do think that there is a lot of goodwill towards the Iranian community within the opposition at the moment, and that's certainly been returned since we've taken the positions that we have publicly. But yeah, I think that that's not only the national security concern, but because there has been that sort of person-to-person contact as well.
I want to transition to our local women's rights issues, but before doing so, just make a contrast, because we will talk about the reaction of some of the political left locally to some of the women's rights issue. But it's always been fascinating that some of the groups that hold themselves out as championing women's rights, whether it's the Greens or some of the feminist groups, some of the left-wing activist groups, seem almost silent on women's rights in Iran. As you said up front, the demonstrations were pushed by young women, and they seem not to have much support from those that are supposedly champions of women's rights here. They're much more interested in, men who identify as women being allowed into toilets. What do you think's happening here? There seems to be a lack of consistency on standards.
Well, sure. I think the reality is that, what we have to remember here in Australia, in a very well-developed country where we're all very fortunate to be able to enjoy the rights and freedoms that we have, that, as much as we might argue over what those rights or freedoms are and whose rights and freedoms should trump others, which is, fundamentally what the sex-based women's rights issues are about, which I'm sure we'll get to in a second. There are other parts of the world where women aren't allowed to get an education. Women aren't allowed to engage in the workforce. Women aren't allowed to own property. Women aren't allowed to really do anything or dress the way that they want to without the say-so of a man. So I think it's always important that we, particularly in Australia, keep that really front of mind, that when we're talking about women's rights, that there is some women out there who are not able to enjoy the same ones that we do, and that is just as much worth fighting for as the tussle over whose rights might trump whose. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there was a high-profile event in Melbourne in March. The Let Women Speak campaigns, of course, were held around the country, but the one in Melbourne seemed to get the bulk of the attention. What's your observation of what happened in Melbourne, Claire? What do you think's going on?
Oh, I think what happened in Melbourne was a real regret. Having neo-Nazis show up to any event that you might be having is not going to be good publicity by any means, but to have that happen, and I saw the media reports of it the day of, or maybe it was the day after, and the way that suddenly just completely derailed in the eyes of particularly the media, but I think in the eyes of some in the public as well, the actual reason why the women were there to start with, I found really disappointing. And all of a sudden we had these issues being conflated, and people asserting that the women who were there advocating for women's only, female only services and sports and spaces must have been, automatically neo-Nazis by association. And I thought that was a really a disgraceful way of categorizing those women to start with, but also it sort of diminishes the neo-Nazism to an extent as well. If you're all of a sudden saying that whoever they share the stage with might be associated with their views are abhorrent in isolation, and that's what we have to remember. It's not about trying to drag other groups into it. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of, I just think was quite reductionist in the way that it conflated all of these issues. And we need to remember that neo-Nazism is dreadful and it should be condemned in the strongest possible terms. But that protest was not about neo-Nazism.
100%. That's actually the issue that got us involved when we saw that, neo-Nazis gate crashed the event. There's a video of what happened. It was most peculiar policing, we thought, where the trans activists were kept out, but this neo-Nazi group was waved through. Still, we can't understand why that happened. But I actually got a phone call from one of the organisers after the event, completely distressed at what had occurred. Now, I know you know some of the people involved, and, from what you know of their backgrounds and their character, etc., is there any truth at all to the accusation that they've got Nazi associations?
Oh, I absolutely not. I don't think so at all. I just think it was it was a narrative that took hold in the media, and I think particularly in the response of some politicians to what had happened. And like I say, we should always condemn neo-Nazism in the most strident of terms, but standing on the steps of Parliament and protesting anything is something that we in a free society should be valuing and should be encouraging, and we shouldn't be finding a convenient opportunity to deplatform anyone, but particularly women who choose to stand up there and protest for their rights and argue for their rights, just because some incredibly unsavoury people decided to.
Agree. If you adopted that standard, it would mean that nobody could go to a public meeting because sometimes some objectionable, even grossly objectionable people might turn up. And that's the case. Well, perhaps the highest profile one, of course, was one of your Victorian colleagues, Moira Deeming. Now, Moira Deeming. Can you make some comment about her and how she was dealt with?
Oh, look, I think Moira was treated pretty badly. She's the latest in a long line of women who have spoken up for women's rights and the ability of women to access single-sex sports and services and spaces, and has been completely defamed and smeared by the media and some politicians for standing up for what she believes in. But we see it happen time and time again. And I've certainly had my fair share of that. I've had my fair share of abuse on social media. I've been subject to an anti-discrimination complaint in Tasmania for writing an email to a constituent that, what was the offending language, that women's sports, women's services and women's facilities were designed for people of the female sex and should remain so. Just for saying that in a piece of correspondence to a constituent, I was taken to the Anti-Discrimination Commission. So what has happened to Moira, like I say, is just the latest in a long, long line. And I think she is a real fighter. She is a fighter for women's rights. She's a fighter for her local community as well. I know she's very passionate about her community in Melbourne. And I think it is a real regret that she's no longer a member of the Parliamentary Liberal Party.
Yeah, I think it's a regret too. I don't know anything about the detail of the potential legal action that she's taking, but I have said on the record that if the Nazi smear is an issue, I'm prepared to be a witness, because I think it's a gross abuse of the term. I think it's undemocratic. And I've got a very dim view of the way that the Victorian Liberal Party leadership has dealt with it. I won't ask you to comment on that. But there is something else related that you've commented on publicly, and we actually put your statement in the Senate concerning gender clinics onto the AJA social media when you made that statement. Can you just comment on the content of that and why you felt motivated to speak out about the gender clinics?
Sure. You might have to refresh my memory as to exactly what I said, because I posted a bit about that. But if it's generally speaking about the gender clinics, I mean, I think we've seen a really concerning trend in past years that is just starting to get reversed, where we know that there has been a massive increase in the number of children, particularly young girls, who are suffering from gender dysphoria and are being treated for gender dysphoria within our health system. And we also know that these treatments that they are receiving, and we know this from international expertise and international reviews of these treatments, are pretty experimental. They raise serious questions about the ability of children to consent when they are getting asked if they want to receive cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers or having life-altering surgery. And as I say, in recent years, there has not been much transparency around the clinical pathways that these children are on, the reasons why there might be a massive explosion of numbers, how do parents feel about this, how do teachers in school feel about this. It's been all really under the cover of darkness. I've asked questions about this at Senate estimates at a federal level. I know that I certainly have state colleagues as well that have continued to ask questions about this, about health bureaucrats, and the answers haven't been forthcoming. But in recent weeks, and listeners tonight might have seen a series of articles in the Australian newspaper. I don't think it was last weekend, I think it might have been the weekend before, that was starting to reveal anonymized stories of parents who have had children suffering from gender dysphoria and the experience that they've had and the experience that their children have. There are reports of teachers in schools raising concerns about whether affirming a child's gender is the right thing to do and what engagement there should be with parents as a result of that, and the ethics around all of this sort of thing. So we're starting to see a lot more attention placed on this now. But as with a lot of these issues, Australia is quite far behind what's happening in other international jurisdictions. The United Kingdom, or probably 18 months ago now, shut down its major gender clinic after an independently run review said that it wasn't creating the right outcomes for kids who were suffering from gender dysphoria or kids who are troubled in that sort of way. So I'm really glad that questions are starting to be asked and that the media in particular is starting to shed a light on all of this, but we have a long way to go before we catch up to where the rest of the world's at.
Yeah, we see it as very problematic. There is a medical ethic which in Latin is primum non nocere, firstly do no harm.
Yeah.
And if you applied that to the way that the radical gender theory is applied and some of the medical interventions, it would break that particular ethic. The other aspect that's had a lot of attention recently, at least publicly, because it's so out there, is things like drag queen story time. There's a couple of legal cases in progress, and local councils and libraries where sometimes it's stories, sometimes it's a little more than stories. It's sort of dancing and in a fairly provocative way, and the audience can be quite young children. Do you have a view on that?
Oh, look, it's an issue that's come up locally in Tassie in recent months, and I know that it's I've seen examples of it happening across the country as well. But I think with all of these things, we have to keep in mind that any sort of entertainment for children should always be age appropriate, and I think there's I'm not convinced that drag queen story time is necessarily going to be age appropriate content for young children. So we should always keep them at the heart of this, and the rights of parents at the heart of this as well, to tell their kids the way that they feel the world works, and be able to raise them with their own values and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Now, finally, before we do our 1-minute promotion and open up for questions, the big political issue that seems to get a lot of attention at the moment is The Voice. And there is, of course, a major women's rights issue in Aboriginal communities, which is that it's the women that tend to get the rough end of domestic violence. We know that in some areas, the rate of hospitalisation of women in Aboriginal communities through domestic violence is 30-something times the national average. Child sexual abuse is a big issue, and it's women and children that seem to get the rough end of the alcohol abuse. How is the government's voice going to fix this?
Well, I take my
rhetorical question.
Yeah, sure. I gathered that. Look, I've listened very carefully to Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price's contributions in the Parliament on these issues, and I've spoken to her directly about these issues, and I take my lead from her. She sees exactly what is happening in remote communities in the Northern Territory, and I know that it is similar in other states as well, particularly Western Australia. And I don't think The Voice is going to make life better for these women and for these children. And you see the reports of sexual abuse, of physical abuse, these broken families in these remote Indigenous communities, and it's just heartbreaking. And I think it's very human to want to do everything that you can to help these families and to equip government with the tools that it needs to help these families. But I'm not convinced that creating another bureaucracy that will sit in Canberra is the way to reach out to these communities and understand what they want. So I will be voting no whenever the referendum is held for a number of different reasons, but pretty close to the top of the list is the fact that I just don't think it's going to make a difference.
Yep. And I'll just add that Senator Jacinta Price has done an exclusive interview with AJA, and anyone who hasn't seen it can go to our YouTube channel and search on her name, and you'll see that. She was quite generous with her time, and a good discussion with Robert Gregory. So I'll do the 1 minute promotion now, which is to say to everyone here at the conclusion of the event, if you haven't yet done anything to actively support AJA, please do go to the website jewishassociation.org.au, where you can apply for membership, you can make a donation, make sure you like and follow the AJA Facebook page, and also on the website you can subscribe to the email list for nothing. Now, next week, we also have another female leader, this time from Israel, talking about the battle for Judea-Samaria with Nadia Matar, who's one of the co-founders of the Women in Green movement. If you're not familiar with that movement, you're in for a treat. And if you want to see another principled female leader tackling a different set of issues, Nadia's the one next week. Okay, so we have a few questions already, and can I remind you please to keep the questions brief, not speeches, and we'll get through them. So Anne, you're first, if you can unmute please and ask your question.
Hi Claire, nice to speak with you. You know, with the march through the institutions, education, the medical institutions, and just on a personal level, I like to know that my doctor thinks I'm a woman because it's useful in treating me. But, you know, it's a sort of insanity that's just there, and it's all pervasive, and it's in the training institutions. So Claire, where do we start?
Oh, that's the $64,000 question, and I've sort of puzzled over that one a lot over the last few years. I mean, honestly, I think you can start wherever you have the ability to start. We've talked a lot about what's happening in schools tonight. We've talked a lot about what's happening in health departments, more broadly in the bureaucracy, but our media institutions have an awful lot to answer for on this front as well. I know, and you know, I won't go into great detail for obvious reasons, but I know of journalists who have tried to report on these issues and been told that they shouldn't be, or you know, to alter their language to conform to you know, press council standards and all of this sort of stuff. So there's not a lot of goodwill on behalf of the media, I think, to report on these issues accurately. And I say this knowing, you know, plenty of people, particularly women, who contact me with concerns around whether it's the treatment of gender dysphoria, whether it's biological men playing in women's sports, all of these things. And that they say, you know, I've gone to the media, I've tried to tell somebody about this, but nobody seems to want to listen. So, you know, try and fight the fight on whatever front you can, to be perfectly honest, because I think it's all very intertwined. I can't really for the life of me figure out where all of this started, but I can certainly see where it's heading to if we don't start to fight back.
Leon, you're next if you unmute.
Yes, good evening, Senator. To what do you attribute this social revolution that's known erroneously as progressivism? which has invaded all of our institutions, really. Do you have any opinion as to why it's taken such a powerful hold on Western societies?
Fascinating.
I mean, again, that's a really interesting question, and one that I have puzzled over. It's interesting that you describe it as progressivism, and I try to be very careful about my language in this regard when I'm discussing these issues, because I cannot tell you the number of people, particularly women, who have contacted me saying, I was previously a Labor voter, I was previously a Greens voter, but I feel like those political parties have completely abandoned me on these issues. But, you know, Claire, you're the only, or for a period of time, I was the only politician who was talking about these publicly, and, you know, not all of them, I think, were going to change their vote to the coalition just on the back of what I was talking about, but they certainly felt politically homeless. So I don't necessarily think it's progressivism. I think it is a very radical ideology that has managed to take hold across our institutions. And I think the extent to which it has done that is explained in some regard by the way social media in particular sort of dictates our public discourse these days. And, you know, the whole concept of cancelling really did start with the onslaught of social media. 7 or 8 years ago, when I was when I was Federal Young Liberal President and Tasmanian Young Liberal President, and we talked about free speech in terms of the government institutions that could shut you down for having certain views. These days, we talk about someone getting cancelled on Twitter, or someone getting attacked with comments on Facebook, and we talk about big businesses, you know, making certain policy decisions and that impact their employees and inhibit their employees' ability to have certain views. So it's very pervasive, but like I said, I think social media has a lot to answer for as to how it's been sort of extrapolated to the point where I think most common sense Australians are sitting here looking at things like the gender debate, and there are a lot of other debates you know, how did it possibly get this out of hand, when in reality it's just a really small but very vocal minority pushing these ideas, and they've been given the mouthpieces to do it by whether it's, you know, the media not wanting to report on it, or social media just being such a toxic tool to conduct public debate.
Ann Nguyen, if you can unmute.
Yeah, sorry for my bad internet connection. Anyway, I didn't know what to go for, so I'll just go with the Islamic regime that's currently happening in Iran, and is now happening in Afghanistan. So there's this brave journalist called Mashin Ani, who has this motto: he exposed the Iran protests. Back to the question at hand, that would highlight the abuse that women are suffering in Afghanistan and in other parts of Islamic countries, besides just Iran.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the internet connection was great there. It was, I think, seeking a comment about the journalists that are trying to expose it.
Oh, well, look, good luck to them. And the other thing I thought I hinted in there was the role of the IRGC or the Iranian regime, not just within Iran, but in other countries. I think Afghanistan might have been raised there as well. And I mean, that's another concern that I have, whether it's you know, the influence of Iran within the Middle East more broadly. We know that they've been providing Russia with support in the war in Ukraine, building stronger ties with the CCPs in China. All of these concerns around the relationships that they're building across the world, and you know, the losing my train of thought here. We know that the IRGC, you know, supports terrorist activity in other countries as well. So they are a very far-reaching regime, and I think perhaps haven't necessarily been given the attention that we should be giving them on the international stage.
Someone with the pseudonym of Antarctic Glider. We'll see who that is. No? Can you unmute? No, maybe frozen. Okay. Sam, you're next.
Thank you, Dr. Adler, and good evening, Senator Chandler. Thank you for allowing me to ask the question. As a person who is of Iranian descent, this is the first time I'm joining such a talk, and again, very briefly, wanted to thank the AJA for highlighting the events in Iran and generally the Jewish Australian community for supporting us and acknowledging the service people of Israel who were killed recently at the Egyptian border by the Egyptian security forces. Senator Chandler, just a small question I have. Recently, there was a video of an Islamic Shiite school, which, as you're well aware, they have got very close connections to the government in Iran and also the government in Iraq. And the children and the parents in that clip were singing a song which was made for Khamenei. And essentially the translation of it is, "Oh, my dear leader." And as you're well aware, the Islamic Republic is institutionally anti-Semite, openly calls for destruction of Israel, and essentially wants to destroy any country that stands against it. As a citizen of this country, I'm concerned about having religious schools that are using our democratic values to essentially recruit children as early age for possible future terrorist attacks against this country and the security repercussions this may have. Have you come across any cases at all? And the other question is, people like myself, who can we talk to about these issues? Who can we highlight them to? We appreciate the Liberal Party being much open to us, and I can tell you that the Labour Party missed an opportunity of having a sizable voting population by not paying attention to our calls for help. But
Sam,
issues like this, I think, are critical to talk about, and we need your help with that as well. Thank you, Dr. Adler.
Completely agree. And look, Sam, that's what we're here for. And if you want to flick me through an email after this, I'm sure David can provide you with my contact details. I'll be more than happy to have a further chat with you about what you've seen and your knowledge of the situation in Iran, given that you are part of the community here.
And Sam, when you put in the email, you need to identify the school. I think that would be helpful. I've seen those videos from overseas. I haven't seen any from Australia. So I'm not sure which one you meant. Ember, you're next, please.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity and great conversation this evening. This is a question for you, Senator Chandler. Firstly, I'm also an Iranian Australian, and just wanted to say a huge thank you to yourself, especially, and a number of other your liberal colleagues, because to be honest with you, we feel like our voices haven't been heard by really anyone except for the Liberal Party. So for that, it's really nice that you've heard those voices. So two questions that I have really, and I guess part of this goes to like why our voices aren't being heard. What more should the Iranian community do to make our voice heard within the Australian government? Specifically, I suppose what I'm trying to ask is, you've noted that we're trying to get the IRGC listed as a terrorist organisation, and from the clips that I've seen of you in Parliament, there does not appear to be any appetite to make that happen. So firstly, what more should we do? And then secondly, what more evidence do you think the government needs than what was already outlined within that Senate inquiry? I suppose what I'm trying to, I guess, express is that we're at a bit of a loss and any sort of guidance in that regard would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, I can understand why you feel that way, and particularly in my more recent conversations with our Iranian community in Australia, I'm getting that sense from them. So I can completely understand. I mean, I likewise am still waiting for the government to respond to the findings from the committee report. I raised that with them in Senate estimates last week, and they said we're considering it, Senator, which is, I wonder if it's code for we'll get a response to you when we feel like getting a response to you. So I would likewise want to see at least acknowledgement of the quantum of the issue. And look, in terms of what the Iranian community needs to be doing, I think contacting members, your local members of parliament, particularly when they are members of the government, and making sure that they are engaging with you and they are understanding the depth of your concern and what you would like to see happen, because, well, at the end of the day, the government is obviously by design the ones that are in a position to do something about this. We as an opposition to put our policy position forward. It is a policy position of the coalition that the IRGC should be listed as a terrorist organisation. I don't think it's a question of having sufficient evidence to be able to list them as a terrorist organisation. We know they're a terrorist organisation. They engage in terrorist activities. Where the government gets down into the details is that they have a legal view that the current framework to list a terrorist organisation doesn't enable them to list the IRGC. That's all well and good. Our position is, and this was the recommendation out of the committee report back in February, is if you don't currently have the legislative tools, change the legislation.
Reza. And can I just remind people to make the questions brief? We've still got quite a few.
Sure, I'll try my best. Am I audible?
Yes.
Actually, my question was asked just by the previous speaker. I wanted to ask what more we can do, but I'll just tell you what we have done, and maybe you can comment on that. We've actually written around about maybe 1,000 physical letters to members of parliament, senators, and members of the House. The pattern that has emerged is that Liberals or their coalition members and independents and Greens, they write their own responses to us. It seems like the Labour responses are all coming from one or two templates. And I personally actually asked one of the officers who has written these templates, because we are kind of sick of receiving the same response. And they said it's coming from the Department of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Attorney General says that the leasing of IRGC is not is under criminal code, and it's not a tool of foreign policy. Why DFAT is responding to a question that is about criminal code, which is not a tool of foreign policy, and how we can actually make them at least care enough to write their own few lines.
Oh, look, that's very disappointing. And I don't want to get too overtly political on this Zoom call, but I'm finding that is an issue across the board in a lot of different policy areas, not just my shadow assistant ministry, that the government is very quick to hand out talking points rather than actually engage with the problems that they see them. So I'm certainly not surprised to see that. But I had a very similar experience when I first started asking questions about these issues at Senate estimates, in that I go to DFAT and they would say you need to go to Home Affairs, and then they would say you need to go to the Attorney General's department. So I guess that's why I make the point that it's important to contact your local members of Parliament, particularly if they're a member of the government, because then it's up to them to engage with ministerial officers on your behalf and find out some responses to your questions.
Okay, Anna, you're next, please.
Yeah, Senator Chandler, we are going to a referendum, which seems to me a very heavy-handed way of going about this, going back to the voice. surely there are other mechanisms where there can be advisory committees set up to talk to on issues, rather than changing the Constitution in a way that creates a whole new bureaucracy and creates a whole lot of other on-flow issues, which we don't know how they will actually end up. So why is there so much determination to go to a referendum?
Well, because that's the road that Mr. Albanese set us down once he won the election. But I mean, I totally agree. And our policy when we were in government was to focus on building a regional voice, an on-the-ground voice, so that the concerns of local communities would be heard at the local level. And I still think that is a very sound policy and one that I'm sure would be open to the government if they wish to consider it. But they have decided to go down this path of not only giving Australians a referendum to change the Constitution. And look, we're not going to stand in the way of Australians having their say on that question. And I think that's an important thing to do, given that this is the road that the Prime Minister has chosen to go down. But he's asking Australians to have their say without putting really any of the detail of what the voice is actually going to look like on the record. I mean, at the end of the day, we'll have to end up legislating whatever the structure of the voice looks like after the referendum, if the referendum passes, after it's successful anyway. So, yeah, I think it's a bit insulting for Australians to have to, go to the ballot boxes, will I suspect, before the end of the year, to answer a question when we really don't know what the possible answers are.
And the sad thing in all of that is that if it doesn't pass, it will be very hurtful to a lot of members of the Aboriginal community.
Yeah. We will do more on the question of the voice at a future date. And I should declare that I'm on the Advisory Board of Advance Australia, which is heavily involved in the No campaign for a whole variety of reasons. John Campbell, please. Yep.
Yeah, hello, Senator. I've asked my local MP for the science behind, the proposal to change birth certificates. So, and they're not forthcoming. I've already asked a number of the Premier's office, they referred to the Attorney General. Attorney General's the office has referred me to the website. Any comment on that?
Look, I mean, I come from Tasmania, which was the first state to allow you to change your gender on your birth certificate, which was at the time touted as, a very small, minimal change that would, only impact a small portion of the population. But the reality is, in allowing people to change their gender on their birth certificate, you're in effect facilitating or creating a legal ability for men to legally identify into the ability to access women's only services, spaces and sports. And we see this every time one of these examples comes up, and the few times that these examples come up in the media, that, the individual, the male who's trying to access the female facilities will say, well, I'm a female on my birth certificate if they've been able to change their birth certificate. So it's ineffective, just sort of legally justifying what is already a very bad policy position in allowing males to identify into female services and spaces.
Gemma, you're next, please.
Hello, Senator. I'm a 17-year-old student, and as a female, I am very passionate about my current rights and my rights in the future growing up in Australia. Now, I grew up really admiring people like the suffragettes who fought for our right to vote, and now I continue to admire people who stand up for basic civil rights, even if it costs them personally, such as yourself. Now, a pattern I've noticed is there's quite a few people, from politicians to journalists to even like local community members, who refuse to stand up for things they know to be right, such as female rights in the transgender debate, by fear of social repercussions, such as being shunned by friends and family, and even in some cases losing their jobs. What do you think it will take for such people to come out and actually stand up for what they would know to be right? Do you think it is too late for my generation to live in a free Australia where females are given the same rights as males and granted the basic rights our ancestors paid for dearly with their freedom?
Oh, I really don't hope, oh, sorry, I'm losing my words. I'm getting close to 9 o'clock. I really hope it isn't too late, Jemima. And it is awesome to hear a young woman on this call who's interested in these topics and is, passionate about the future. So keep doing everything that you're doing. That's just so fabulous and really nice to hear from you. Look, I can totally understand why women don't feel confident to speak out about these issues because of the experiences that I have had, whether it was, like I talked about, being taken to the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner because of my views, or some of the social media pile-ons that I've had to experience have been pretty horrific. I've certainly lost personal friends out of advocating for the positions that I've advocated for. Which makes me really sad. But at the end of the day, I'm in a very fortunate position in that I am an elected member of an Australian Parliament. I have a platform that I'm able to use to talk about these issues, and not every woman has that. In fact, most women don't have that. So I can understand why women feel scared to speak out. My hope is that enough women and men as well, men can talk about these issues as well, find themselves in a privileged position like mine and use that for good, and use that to be able to shine a light on these issues and to speak about their concerns, particularly in relation to the erosion of women's sex-based rights. But it is a hard slog. I do hope that the next woman who talks about it after me will have a slightly easier experience. I certainly hope the next woman who talks about it after Moira Deeming has a far easier experience than what she has had in Melbourne. But I also think that, we are starting to see the tide turn on some of these issues, where we now see international sporting bodies implementing rules that preserve women's sport for females, where, like I said earlier, starting to see newspapers actually reporting on concerns of parents and teachers regarding the treatment of gender dysphoria in children. So we have to keep speaking up, and I think the tide will turn eventually.
Okay, we've got 2 final questions. We'll see if we can get them in, if they're very brief, please.
I'll try and make quick answers as well, David.
Marsa, Australia.
Yes, thank you very much, David and Senator. I'm an Iranian Australian, and I really thanks for your time and effort so far. Basically, I have a question, which is, I understand that the government hasn't done anything to prescribe IRGC, but if the government doesn't have the stomach to do this, why shouldn't we target IRGC hands in Australia? I'm talking about, for example, recently, UK shut down an Islamic center in London with a link to the supreme leader of Iran. And most, if you Google, for example, Islamic centers in Australia, you will see some of them with a very apparent link to the IRGC and Islamic Center.
Okay, I think we're just very close to time, so I'll get the Senator to comment on that.
Sure. Look, that was one of the recommendations from the Senate report back in February, that we needed to be, in effect, downgrading our diplomatic relations with Iran to a bare minimum in response to their behaviour, but also we need to be doing everything we can to identifying Iranian officials, I should say, within Australia that are conducting foreign interference activity or intimidation of the community, and make sure that they're deported. So that's all in the report. Again, let's cross our fingers that the government responds to it at some point.
Okay, and Antarctic Glider wants to try to have another go at unmuting. but we seem to have a technical problem now. Try again. Unmute. Can you do it? No. Okay. Not to worry. Someone's stuck on mute.
The fantastic glider wants to email me. I'm sure I'll be able to come up with a good response.
Okay, I'm sure, and all your responses have been very good. You might have lost some friends, but you've also made others, and that's not entirely a bad journey. I want to thank you very, very much for your time and for your candidacy in answering the questions clearly and honestly. And we hope that your endeavours meet a great deal of success and that you will transition from a shadow ministry into a real one into the not too distant future.
We're all hoping for
that. Just before we go, the L'chaim program with Morris Klein is now on 3ZZZ. That's FM 92.3 in Melbourne, or 3ZZZ.com.au. That's all for tonight, and we look forward to presenting another discussion next week at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.